Hello and welcome to Cymera, Britain's only book festival celebrating science fiction, fantasy and horror writing. My name is Anne Landman and I'm the festival's founder and artistic director. Right about now, I'd hope to be welcoming you to beautiful Edinburgh, to our venue The Pleasance, for a weekend packed with events. Writing workshop, panels, readings, open mics, a quiz, a ceilidh, 2 plays. We had so much in store for you. Thank you for joining us online instead, to be part of our programme from the safety of your homes. We're very excited to still bring you a fantastic lineup of speakers. We'd ask you that you support our speakers, and there's many ways you can do that. You can buy their books or borrow them from the library. You can donate to them directly via their Patreon or Ko-fi. You will find the links for that below in the description. We encourage you to buy a ticket for our events, even the pre-recorded ones. All ticket money will go directly to our speakers. You can also donate to the festival, and all donations via the donation page will be split between our speakers, once we've covered our costs like the Zoom account. Thank you again for joining us in this brave new world of digital events. We hope you have a chance to check out all 33 of ours over the weekend. Please let us know what you think of them. Do get in touch via social media, the chat function in Zoom, or drop us an email on info@chymerafestival.co.uk. We'd love to hear from you. We hope you have a fantastic weekend, and we look forward to seeing you in person next year for Cymera 2021.
Hi, welcome to Cymera 2020 online. My name is Anna Stevens and I am the author of the Goblin trilogy, the third book of which is Bloodchild, which came out at the end of last year. I am joined by Peter McLean and Justin Anderson, and we are going to be talking about creating fantasy worlds and fantasy adventures. So guys, if you'd like to introduce yourselves.
Oh, hi, thanks, Anna. I'm Peter McLean, and I think you need to turn your off. Yeah. Sorry. I'm Peter McLean, author of the War for the Rose Throne series. The day before yesterday, I would have said trilogy, but it is now actually going to be a quartet. So, Priest of Bones is the first book. Priest of Lies is the most recent one. You'll be getting, pandemic permitting, Priest of Gallows around this time next year, and the conclusion in Priest of Crowns in 2022.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Lovely. I'm Justin Lee Anderson. I'm the author of comedy fantasy Carpet Diem and The Lost War, which is the first book of the Eden trilogy, which is an epic fantasy mystery kind of vibe. I'm currently writing the second book in the Eden trilogy, which should be out early next year, all going well.
Excellent. Okay, cool. So I've got a few questions prepared in advance on this subject of creating fantasy worlds and adventures. I think what is good about this panel is that we've all taken fairly different approaches to our fantasy worlds. So I think a good opening question would be why you chose the particular setting that you did, and what is it about this setting that lends itself to the story you're telling? So Pete, do you want to go first?
Yeah, it's such a shame we're not doing this in person, because obviously we should have been in Edinburgh, and Priest of Bones is set in a city called Ellenberg that basically is based on Edinburgh, which it's a wonderful place. It's my wife's hometown, so we go up to Edinburgh quite a lot. The setting for Ellenberg is pretty much based on Edinburgh Old Town. So if you've read the book and you're familiar with Edinburgh, the Great Temple of All Gods is where the castle is. The Governor's Hall is where St Giles is. The Stink and the Wheels are in Princes Street Gardens, and the East River is Princes Street, effectively.
Wow. So was that a choice that you made because you love the city so much?
It's partly because I love the city so much, and partly because it suits the story I wanted to tell.
Okay.
Edinburgh used to be called Old Reekie because it was such a filthy place in the sort of 16th, 17th centuries. Massive overcrowding, poverty. industry, and it stank to high heaven. And that's exactly the setting I wanted for Priest of Bones, because it's a gangster story in a fantasy hat, basically. And I wanted that noirish, downtrodden inner city kind of vibe going for it. And I thought, well, given that it's set in a roughly Tudor Elizabethan time period, I thought that's absolutely perfect. That's exactly what Edinburgh was like in those days. And it made the designing the city really easy, and I'm lazy, so that was great.
Did you also get to justify a lot of weekends in Edinburgh as research?
It's between me and my accountant, Anna.
Awesome. Justin, what about you?
Well, see, you started there by saying we all took very different approaches to building our world. Eden is entirely based on Edinburgh. I am an Edinburgh boy. And
oh my word!
The entire country of Eden is based on the history and the etymology of locations in Edinburgh. Edinburgh place things. So yes, the entire country is essentially a country exploded out based on the history of Edinburgh and the etymology of all its different individual place names. So apparently we have something very unusual in common there.
Considering
that I didn't know about.
We've never even spoken before. That is one hell of a coincidence.
I didn't know that about you. I mean, I haven't yet read Priest of Bones, but it is on my TBR list. And now that I know it's based in Edinburgh, it's getting bumped higher up my TBR list.
Excellent stuff.
Excellent. Cool. Okay. So was there aside from being an Edinburgh boy, Justin, was there any other reason why that was the location that spoke to you for The Lost War?
So Edinburgh's always been a really kind of special place for me. Although I was born here, I didn't grow up here. We moved to the US when I was about 3 or 4, and I grew up over there. And we only moved back here in my teens. And it always had a kind of a sort of magic about it. It always felt to me like going back in time. Because the massive difference between sort of, American culture in the 70s and 80s when we were there, and coming back here to see buildings that were, substantially older than the country I'd just come from. It just had this amazing magical feeling and allure to me that I've always loved. And I've moved away a few times for different reasons, but I've always come back here. It's always felt like home, regardless of how long I've been away. And it just has this great special history to it. I mean, we've got a medieval castle and a billions of years old volcano in the middle of the town. It's just such a great city, and I know a lot about it. Sort of, one of my previous life jobs, I used to write a tourist guide to Edinburgh, and so as part of that, I did quite a lot of research into the history of the city and the mythology, the folk tales, the ghost stories. There's so many ghost stories, in Edinburgh. There's just such a wealth of kind of untapped inspiration there. I think, well, not necessarily untapped, quite a few people have tapped it, but for me, untapped inspiration there. And it just, I love it. It's just got such an appeal to me that writing a story set in a fantasy world based on all of that was really appealing.
Cool. Great. Okay.
Edinburgh is almost a ready-made fantasy city, isn't it? As you say, with a volcano in the middle of it, and the castle perched on top of this great crag of basalt. I mean, you couldn't ask for more for a fantasy setting, could you? Really?
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Stuff.
Great. You guys have actually thought about these questions a lot more than I have, because I had just written down battles and gods as my answer to this question. So why did I choose a fantasy setting? I wanted to write about battles and I wanted to have some gods in it. So I was like, well, obviously it's got to be fantasy then. Okay, cool. So Pete, you said that it's basically a gangster story dressed up as fantasy. So yeah. I suppose the question is, why did you choose a gangster story?
I'm a big gangster fan. Absolutely, I love it. I grew up, and I probably shouldn't have done, but I grew up reading Mickey Spillane and Mario Puzo and that sort of stuff. The Godfather is one of my favourite films. I will confess, I usually can't stand fantasy movies. I like science fiction, but fantasy movies I'm not a big fan of. So if I'm going to watch a film, it's probably going to be something like Goodfellas or Casino or whatever. I love that genre, but it doesn't sell books anymore. I mean, if I had been writing in the sort of the 40s through the 60s, I'd be a multi-bloody millionaire writing that stuff like Biggie Spillane was. But nobody publishes the stuff anymore, as far as I know. If anybody knows better, hit me up. But so I wanted to write that sort of story, but obviously I am a massive fantasy nerd. So I thought, this is two of my favourite things. I'll ram them together and see what happens, which is basically what I did.
Well, it turned out very well, I have to say.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so for both of you, what came first, setting or story? So was it your fantasy Edinburgh or was it your gangsters? And
character, absolutely. I always start with the character, and
okay.
I think where they get set and what they do depends on who they are. So I'd come up with my fantasy gangster character, and then, as I say, I wanted to set him in the sort of place that would have produced a man like that. And as I say, that then turned into being based on Edinburgh, because why wouldn't you? But so I started with Thomas Piety the way he is, and I wanted to do the war veteran thing with him and the PTSD, battle shock, whatever you want to call it, because that doesn't get done very often, and I thought it deserves to be. So I definitely started out with the character, and the character led to the setting, and then I thought, well, what are they actually going to do? What happens in a city like this? The setting then led to the plot, effectively.
Okay, cool. And Justin, was it a similar experience for you?
So with The Lost War, I actually had what I thought were three different ideas. In the first place, I wanted to write a story set in this fantasy kingdom based on Edinburgh. The other idea was that we had these characters that friends and I had been role-playing for a decade that I loved and I thought were really interesting, and I thought that they would make good characters for a story. And then I also had a notion for an idea of a story I wanted to write that was a kind of an allegory that said things about politics and culture and truth to some extent. And so I had what I thought were three completely different ideas. And then one day they kind of fell together, and I was like, well, wait a minute, those characters and that setting and this storyline and this concept, that all works really nicely as one story. And that's when I realized it was one book. So it was really what I thought were three different ideas, which I realized was one book.
Cool. Okay, that's really interesting, because that's a slightly different process. I think for me, I'm more similar to Pete in that I tend to get I'll get a sense of a character first, and then it sounds crazy, but I will literally get them start talking to me in my head. Like it's almost like not necessarily introducing themselves, but they'll just start commenting on things that are going on, like this little like like a little blah blah blah. And then from there I'll be like, right, okay, well that's a sense of that character. Who am I going to put in opposition to that character? And then I'll come up with someone else. And then from there, I think once I've got my sort of a main person on each side, then I'll start building up, well, why are they enemies, and the sort of the setting, and then the plot will come from that. My new series, which I am writing at the moment, the first one of which comes out in November, actually works slightly differently. I started with a single image, which was really unusual for me, and I just started with an image of bare feet standing at the edge of a river, and that was it. And it was very lush and green, and I had like sort of sound like a sensation that it was really hot and humid and stuff like that. And this image just came out of absolutely nowhere, and I started thinking more and more about it, and that image then led to that main character, and then we went through the same process again. But it was just quite interesting that I had, instead of having a voice this time, I actually had a picture in my head, which I haven't had before. So I mean, for me, for example, I'm not 100% sure what any of my characters look like.
Mm.
I don't think it's hugely necessary. I think readers will make their own decisions as to what your characters look like anyway, so I don't fill in more than the most basic of details. But I do know what this character's feet look like, which is really weird.
That's very specific.
It's very specific, really specific. So how do you?
Before we move on, Anna, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
So if the characters came to you first out the Godblind trilogy, who were the characters who came to you first?
Okay, for Godblind, it was Rillarin and Dom.
Okay.
Which they were like the main power couple for
Right.
a very, very long time. And then they just, more and more characters started building up around them, until they became one of two or possibly three, depending on your opinion, of like the main sort of power couples in it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it was Rillarin and Dom to start with. And then by the end it was Chris and Ash. And I always feel slightly guilty. I feel like I've kind of like, oh, who cares about Rillarin and Dom, which is not the case at all. But Chris and Ash's story ended up taking a certain amount of precedence towards the end, which was
what you
interesting.
did to Dom, that's shocking. That's it really is.
I'm a terrible, terrible person. I know.
I think we all are at heart.
I think so. At least it comes out in the books rather than in any other, you know.
Yeah, it's not that we're doing this to our children.
Precisely. Okay, so how do you build up a convincing world? Do you have a toolkit? Is there a specific set of things that you like to do? Or is it more sort of quite chaotic and ideas just come to you as you're drafting and you then have to go back and retrofit them all in?
No, so I'm a real bit of a history nerd, I must admit.
Okay.
For me, it doesn't have to be a historical setting, but it has to work, I think. I mean, you get things sometimes, on a bit of a cliche, but you might in a fantasy novel, or especially in a fantasy movie, come across, the giant city in the middle of the desert with no trade links, no agriculture, and 100,000 people living there eating fairy dust. That sort of thing drives me up the wall. So for me, it's got to work. Yeah. I mean, our sort of fantasy I write is called, people call it grimdark, and I'm not sure I agree with that really, but nobody can agree what it means. Anna and I did a whole panel about what does grimdark mean last week for something else, and nobody agreed with anybody else about anything. I don't think. But
I've seen those panels, and nobody agrees.
No, never ever. But my dear friend R.J. Barker once famously described grimdark as historical fiction for people who would quite like a wizard to have been there, and I think that's kind of what I write. Really, it's not historically accurate in any way, shape, or form. But if you have one thing, you've got to have the other things that make it work for me. So I wanted heavy industry. So how do you have heavy industry when you don't have steam technology even? The city's on a river, giant whacking great water wheels all the way down the river, because anything that turns you can hook up to gears and spindles and run a machine off it. So that works. And heavy industry, what are they? Where's it all come from? Right, so there's hills to the west, there's mines in those hills, there must be, kind of thing. All the agriculture's to the south, because obviously they're not living on fairy dust like the people from the giant desert city. And so I'm rabbiting. I could go on about this topic all day and probably have done and bored people senseless in the past, but it's that kind of thing. If you've got technology A, you have to have all the previous technologies that led to technology A. You can't have somebody with a cell phone in a culture that hasn't invented the Babbage engine yet. You just can't. And that sort of thing is a real bugbear of mine, as you can probably tell.
Okay, cool. Justin, what about you?
So I read a really interesting article years back. I want to credit it to Tom Lloyd. I can't remember if he pointed me at it or whether he wrote it. but it was a really interesting article about how world building is in the details. And a lot of it is about dropping in something which suggests much more behind it. And it was based on the idea of the safety clip on Lando Calrissian's belt in Star Wars.
I was going to mention this.
Have you read this?
Scott Lynch wrote it.
Did he? Okay, so Tom must have pointed me at it or retweeted it or something at some point. I just, in my head, it's associated with him. But it's such a great article, and it really, it basically suggests that this safety clip on Lando Calrissian's belt that he attaches as he's being raised out the hatch of the Millennium Falcon at the end of Empire is there because there's some kind of health and safety inspectorate or something that exists in this universe that has basically said you can't go on a hatch out the top of a spaceship without having a ring clip attached to keep you from being blown away. And it's little things like that I think are really interesting, and it's dropping in things like that throughout the world that I find really intriguing. And it's those little details that I feel makes it a richer, kind of deeper world that people can fill in the blanks themselves for. So I think if you have a good idea though, but if you just drop details in here and there, if you think, oh, that'd be an interesting thing, I'll just put a little bit of detail in about that, or a little bit of detail about this, or maybe there's a mill over there. Yes, that makes sense. There's a mill over there because there's farmland to the west, and there's a town here that trades, and a lot of the trade is in baked goods. So yes, there's a mill here feeding the bakers here. Yes, little things like that people can then fill in the details for. I think that makes for a richer kind of experience all around.
Yeah,
it makes it work. I like that. It makes it all work. Yeah, definitely.
Because I don't see it very often, but occasionally you will come across something and you'll think, oh, that's not quite how I expected all of this to work. It's things like, so in my first trilogy, you've got, I think it's 50 coppers make a silver, 20 silvers make a gold in terms of currency. And it's like, okay, but how much does a copper buy you? And then when you scale that up, what can you buy for a gold? And it's almost like if it costs 10 coppers for a loaf of bread, but it costs a gold for a night in an inn or something, then that, unless that is the best bread you've ever eaten in your life, that doesn't scale up properly. And I think sometimes you can see it in books where you think they haven't thought through the full range of economics. So yeah, it is, the devil is in the detail, I think, in things like that. And if something just wouldn't work, like your desert city where, what is it they're eating and drinking, and here have another sand pie for dinner, so
yeah, it's like you get those floating cities up in the sky with waterfalls pouring off them, and they look beautiful, and you think, well, where's that water coming from, where's it going? And what are they eating, how does this work?
yeah definitely it is that difference between your fantasy visual image of just a completely unrelated, look at me, I just painted this picture of a floating city with a waterfall on it, and you're like, oh wow, amazing, and then it's turning that single image into a book and making it believable. There's a lot more that goes into that, isn't there?
Yeah. I think authors probably spend a lot more time thinking about that stuff than readers do. I think readers probably will forgive an awful lot that they have, we'll be sitting thinking about, right, how much does this coin run? As long as you say, oh, I tossed her a few coins for the goblet of wine, they don't care. As long as you paid for it, it's fine. But we obsess about it more as I can't possibly get this wrong. There has to be consistency between how much he pays for his wine and how much she pays for her outfit. I have to know what the difference is.
Yeah,
definitely. I think you're right about the readers being forgiving. I mean, I haven't read the Witcher books, but I watched the TV show, and I remember seeing a comment from somebody on Twitter along the lines of, "Have you noticed that whatever it is, absolutely everything in The Witcher costs precisely one bag of gold?"
Yes, it's true. That's really funny. That's absolutely true. They just toss pouches of coins back and forth to each other, and that's how much it costs.
And people catch it and go, yep, that's exactly the right amount. I don't need to pay.
Incredible.
I opened it. It'll be full of dirt.
Yeah.
And yeah, here we are. Yeah, here we. I mean, I watched it and loved it. I thought it was a great series. But we don't. Did I care? No, it was
No,
mildly
exactly that.
amusing.
I didn't even
A mildly
notice till
amusing detail.
no, until I saw it pointed out in this tweet. I didn't even notice, to be honest, as a consumer, and then in my head. But yeah, as an author, obviously, I wouldn't dream of doing that.
Yeah.
Very strange.
Yeah. I think we over worry about what readers are going to get pulled out of the story by.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think we do.
Yeah. But then, I mean, there is always going to be that one reader who will get in touch with you and say, no, I think you did on page 87. That would work.
This came up on a panel I did at FantasyCon a couple of years ago, and I remember saying, there's always that one guy, and the panelist next to me turned to me and said, actually, I'm that one guy, and I'm like, no!
No way!
Oh, it was
I bet that was such an awkward panel.
Oh, he was. I can't remember who it was now. So I can't remember who it was to save my life, but he was a really cool guy, and we just had a laugh about it.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Oh dear. Okay, so I think we all probably over research and over plan our societies and economies slightly too much in cases. How much planning goes into the actual story, on the other hand? So how much do the world and the plot influence each other? And does one dominate? Justin?
For me, for The Lost War anyway, as I said, it was a real balance, because I had these three different aspects that all came together. With The Lost War, I had in terms of plot, I had this premise, which was essentially, this is what underlies everything, and it's I know what the last scene in the book is, I know where it ends, I know what the premise is, and everything else that happens in the book was informed by that. So I effectively started at the end, and then went back to the beginning and wrote from the beginning. So from there on, I had, I suppose, what you would call beats I knew I wanted to hit. So there was like, okay, from here, I know they're going to go to there, and this is going to happen. And then they're going to go to there, and this is going to happen. And then they're going to split, and they're going to go there, and they're going to there. But it was all kind of logistics as much as anything else, and plot points. But in between, getting from one to the other, how the character relationships were going to develop and such, that all happened organically as I was writing. So that the relationships that developed and such, I really hadn't planned how that was going to go. I wasn't sure how that was going to work out. So that all happened while I was writing. But I knew logistically where I was going from beginning to end, and the kind of markers I wanted to hit on the way.
Okay. And just because you did say that it's based on characters that you and your friends have role played, did you feel there was a certain like a pressure on you to not do anything that your players wouldn't want you to do?
So that's a really good question. So to begin with, I found myself second guessing what I was thinking of doing with the characters because of whose characters they were. And I literally had to stop myself during like an early writing session and go, right, I have to divorce these characters from the people who played them, because I'm going to do much more interesting things with them that they may not like, but not the things that they wouldn't do, I suppose. And I had to really start thinking of the characters as representing those people and completely divorce them. And it was only at that point I could go, right, now I can do anything with them. And now I can serve the characters and serve the story instead of being slightly constrained by the baggage that came with them. So yeah, I did have to consciously make that decision.
Cool. Sorry, Pete.
Yeah, I worked a fairly similar way. I mean, I knew the end of what's now the fourth book in War for the Rose Throne before I started writing the first one. So I always do. I did with my previous work as well. I like to know where I'm going, I think, for want of a better word for it. And I mean, much like Justin says, I'll plot out the beats as I go and how you get from one scene to another. I already know, the next two books, I know who lives, who dies, who ends up hating each other, who ends up in love, and all this kind of thing. But I think coming back more to the original question about, does the plot drive the world or the world drive the plot? The world doesn't exist until the plot starts, really. So I start with a character, come up with where he came from. When I started writing scene one, I knew there was a capital city, and I knew it was called Danzburg. what was in between Ellenberg and Dansberg, don't know, don't care beyond the mines, because we're not going there in this book. Worry about that in the next book when we go there. So in Priest of Lies, we go to Dansberg, and I'm thinking, kind of need to mention other places now. Where else is there in this? I've no idea what the country's called. It is never named. I don't know because the plot doesn't need me to know. You know, it's a funny thing. It's like they are almost in my head movie sets rather than a world. I've got this scene is set in blah, which is on soundstage A kind of thing. It's, I don't know, a baker's shop for argument's sake, whatever it is. And I'll sit down and I'll be able to absolutely see that baker's shop. Yeah. And everything in it. And I can see the baker. I don't know what's over the road because he's not looking that way. You know what I mean? That's just kind of how my head works. I don't know if I missed my trick in life as a movie director or something, but that I see it in shots and scenes rather than holistically. So if the plot doesn't go somewhere, it don't exist. Simple as that. Or no, the plot doesn't go somewhere. If something doesn't need to be mentioned, it doesn't exist. So in book 3, assuming it survives edits, you'll be briefly going to a place called Varnberg, which is apparently, I discovered in the course of writing, on the coast. I didn't know that until then. I'd mentioned it in Priest of Lies, but faintest idea where it was, but I do now because we've been there.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, I think I pretty much do the same thing. I know where we start. Well, no, I don't know where we start. I never know where we start. I know where we finish. I always think I know where we start, and then I get like 50,000 words in and realize we should not have started there at all. This just doesn't make any sense. And then I go back and start again, which is an incredibly wasteful way of writing, but is also the only one that works for me. And then, yeah, I'll know like maybe 3 or 4 major beats of what needs to happen. But how we get there and what happens in between, and you know, the decisions characters make, all of that is just whatever comes out of my brain on that particular day. I mean, for instance, I was writing earlier before this panel, and I've got an outline, a very vague outline, but I do have an outline for books 2 and 3 of the new series, and they need me to go that way. And I was writing and I've gone that way. And I have literally, I wrote a chapter today that I'm really excited about, but it turns absolutely everything up on its arse. And I'm just like, do I go for it? Do I stick with it? I mean, fortunately, you know, editors and publishers, they don't really remember what your outline said at the start of your contract. And as long as you can make good on the story, I don't think they really care. So I'm sure it will be fine, but it does mean that instead of having a clue about where I'm going, I now need to change fairly fundamental things. But that's kind of the fun of it. I think if you're too rigid, then if you're not having fun writing it, people aren't going to have fun reading it. And I think that's really true. It's your emotions as the writer, they have to come through onto the page. It's like I've always said, you know, no tears in the writer, there's no tears in the reader, and you know, which is why I sobbed my way through my 3rd book, because otherwise there's not the emotion. I didn't think that the emotions would actually come through properly. What was my question?
I don't know. That was ages ago. I don't know.
I've forgotten what the question was. But it's interesting what you say about becoming paralysed if you're too rigid with your outline. Because I was getting like that writing Priest of Gallows. I said to you before the call, I had a 15-page outline for this thing that's mercifully now turned into 2 separate books. But I think I was at around the 60k mark, which is usually the death point for me with any book. That is the point at which the book goes from being the book to the effing book. Do you know what I mean? And I realised it's because I'd got bored, because I knew every single shot and scene from now at the end. And I was almost like, contracts aside, what's the point in writing it? This isn't fun. So I just went absolutely off-piste. I was like, nope, we're going to do this instead. Threw the outline over my shoulder. But I am firmly of the belief that the definition of synopsis is thing your editor takes to the acquisitions meeting, then puts in a drawer and forgets about. I'm sure it'll be fine.
And thank God they do. Because
absolutely.
They never end up the same.
No, they don't. They really don't.
Okay. So staying on the subject of the adventure or the plot, are there any key requirements that help you make a compelling storyline? So is there like a specific trope or a plot twist, or a particular set scene that you've always wanted to write, and so you've written an entire book just in order? So, for example, I had an early arc of a historical fantasy called She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan, which is not out until next year. And I'm on like a Discord channel with her. So I was kind of like almost like live tweeting my reaction as I was reading it, and I got to the scene, and basically just sent her a barrage of abuse because of what she'd done to these characters, all good-natured but extremely abusive, because I was like rooting for these characters so much, and then she literally just tore their lives apart. And she just responded saying, that was the scene that I'd always wanted to write, so I had to write a book just to be able to write that one scene. So I was just wondering, is there anything, with the current series that you're working on at the moment, was there one thing that you particularly wanted to explore or particularly wanted to address, and why?
Yeah, I really wanted to do PTSD as a major plot thread, as I said before, because it's so unusual to see. And I mean, obviously, Tolkien was a veteran of the Great War, and it's very apparent in the final chapters and the harrowing of the Shire that what's going on, that is Frodo's PTSD manifesting. And that's something I really wanted to do, because you see, I mean, I love the Wheel of Time, I really do, but you have these massive battles against hellish monsters and people dead in their thousands, and the Aes Sedai weaves a bit of healing magic. Nobody's hurt anymore, and let's go galloping off on our next adventures. Tally ho, chaps! Everyone's fine. I know Rand has his famous wobble, but as far as I remember, he's the only one that ever actually does, and that is quite common. So, I mean, not only my main character Thomas Piety, but nearly everyone he knows is an absolute broken wreck. Because it ends. Oh no, sorry! It starts just after the war has ended, so you don't actually see them in battle, but you get him. He gets flashbacks, he has rages and shocks, and his brother's in a worse state than he is, and nearly everyone is. And I really wanted to explore that. I think people who serve deserve to be represented properly.
Yeah.
And I've had quite a few serving military tell me that I got it right, so I hope I did. But yeah, that was something I definitely wanted to do.
Okay, Justin, anything for you?
That's. I mean, just quickly, I want to follow again on the basis that we did completely different things. So the Lost War begins right after a war has finished.
Oh, okay.
You two are weird. There's something weird going on here.
Well, I would imagine we were paired for this panel for that reason, but considering we don't know each other from Adam, it's extraordinary. It really
presumably,
is.
this has something to do with it. But yes, so the Lost War also begins right after war, and one character in particular, it's not expressly stated, but one character is suffering from PTSD quite badly, and he's a mess, and the others are all pretty haunted by the experience that they've been through. So that's just another. Again, maybe it was deliberate. I don't know, but it's a mad coincidence if it wasn't. For me, yes, there was one thing I wanted to explore, and I can't tell you what it is without completely spoiling the end of the book. And I know you've read it, so I know you know. But I had this idea, and I thought that'd be a great way to tell an entire story if this was the case.
It was.
And so that kind of underpinned it. And Pete, I'll quite happily ruin it for you off air if you're interested in know what it is.
No, don't do that, because I want to read it now, so don't spoil it for me.
Okay, then I won't do that. But yeah, so yes, there was. I had this idea of I want to do this a storyline as an allegory for this, and so that's where it came from.
Okay.
Which is not really helpful at all, I suppose, to anybody who doesn't know what I'm talking about.
But people who have read The Lost War will be sitting there, as I did at the time, cursing your name and going, I cannot believe you pulled that off. It was done so well. It was done
Thank
so
you.
Okay. So sticking with fantasy tropes for a minute, is there, as fantasy readers rather than writers, is there one thing that for you is either if this is included, I will definitely buy this book because I know I'm going to like it, or is there one thing that has to be included for you to categorize a book as fantasy? And if so, what is that one thing?
Ooh, it's a difficult one. I mean, in answer to the first question, no, because I like to read all sorts of different things. So I haven't got a must-have or anything. I've got one or two must-not-haves, but that's slightly different. I don't have any must-haves in a fantasy novel or in any sort of novel, really. I mean, categorizing something as fantasy, I mean, technically all fiction is fantasy because you made it up. But I think for me to call it fantasy, it has to either be our world, but it must have magic in it, or not be our world. Because for all that I would get stoned to death at EasterCon for saying this, I regard science fiction as a subgenre of fantasy. There, I said it. I know. If it's not on our world, it's fantasy. End of.
Pete McLean blacklisted from every convention.
Oh, I know. Some people often say it's got to have magic in it to be fantasy. No, it hasn't. I mean, we've had this conversation before. If it's not on Earth in a time period we recognise, then it's fantasy for me.
Okay, cool. Justin?
Oh, see, so my instinctive reaction was going to be magic, but that'd be contradicting Pete completely.
But contradict me away.
But I think for me, I do. If you say fantasy, I think magic, almost instinctively. Now I know there are some good fantasy books that haven't included magic, and what they have included is non-human creatures or I suppose things which are impossibilities in the normal world, the mundane world as it is, maybe either races of some other kind or whatever. I mean, I suppose, is Doctor Who fantasy? There's not, they quite clearly try to establish that anything that happens that seems like magic is actually just science, and any sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic.
Yeah.
But I think that is my element. I think if you say to me what defines a fantasy genre for you, it's probably magic.
Okay. Cool. Good. I was just curious. So, okay, I think we're going to have to spin this one out because we've got 8 minutes left. It's my last question. And I'm sure you can do it. I got faith in you guys. Okay, so what is the one thing you love most about writing fantasy? Why fantasy?
Oh, crikey. I think for me, it's because you can do absolutely anything you like. I mean, the next series I write after War for the Rose Throne is going to be another secondary world fantasy. It's going to be much more, well, I say it's going to be. For one, I'm presupposing I can sell the damn thing. For another, I'm presupposing I don't change my mind in the next 3 years. The intent I've got at the moment is to do something much more fantastical. Because, I mean, yeah, the War for the Rose Throne series is historical fiction for people who'd like a wizard to be in it, really. But I want to do, full-on walking immortals kind of thing, big scale Malazan-ish style, utterly impossible things for fun, to be honest, because it'll be fun.
Yeah. Cool.
And
Yeah, I agree. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's freedom you get with fantasy that you
Mhm.
don't get in other genres. You can't do absolutely anything you like in a romance novel or a crime novel. You know, there are certain genre rules, especially in romance, that one has to follow. But fantasy, nah, do what you like. Well, that's like RJ's Bone Ships. The setting's phenomenal. It's bonkers, but he just makes it work. You know, it's absolutely wonderful. Love it to bits. And you can't do that. And I suppose you can do it in science fiction as well to an extent, but even so, you've got to have some degree of plausibility. Nobody's going to have an open top spaceship and get away with it, are they? But in a fantasy, you can have magic flying carpets if you want. You can ride dragons if they'll let you. You know, nothing else gives you that degree of playtime. Want of a better word for it.
Cool.
Yeah, freedom was exactly the word I was thinking of when you said that. Freedom is the thing. There's no constraints. I mean, you can basically create the world as you want to, and anything you can imagine you can do it. But also, I think, particularly with sort of the tradition of sort of historical fantasy, I think it also has constraints which are useful for storytelling, because one of the difficulties I think you can get into with, I would say, what sort of contemporary storytelling is, the fact that we now all have, you know, a phone in our pockets means that at any point, any one of us can communicate with anybody else or look something up on the internet, or, you know, we have such a communications, you know, accessibility. And a lot of stories would get completely clobbered by that if you could literally just, you know, for example, the number of stories you see where the first thing happens is somebody goes, oh, I've got no phone signal. Well, they're establishing that because it's important that they're not able to phone anybody, because if they're able to just phone somebody and get out of trouble, there's no story. And so I think that the historical setting of it, and I think it's why people set a lot of things, even in contemporary stuff, they set it further back in the past before the invention of smartphones and mobile phones, because those get you out of so many holes that, you know, it actually in some ways makes it difficult to write a story with some mystery or sense of threat in it, because there are so many easy ways out of it. And so I think it has the combination of the freedom to do whatever you want with your imagination, but also the fact that you can't just immediately talk to somebody on the other side of the world and tell them something that you need them to know, which would completely solve the entire problem of the plot.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I spent far too long researching how far carrier pigeons can fly for the Gobline trilogy, because I was like, oh my God, especially in the second book, which is set around a siege, I was like, but they need to tell them stuff, but they're like 2 weeks away. How the hell, you know, how am I going to do this? Yeah. And because I know this fact, which is that a carrier pigeon can fly 60 miles an hour for 10 hours a day.
Really?
600 miles.
Wow.
The fastest, like the best. That is why I do not completely disbelieve the whole Daenerys getting on a dragon and flying from Dragonstone to north of the Wall to save Jon Snow. Because what's his face ran back, they sent a raven, so we assume that the raven is probably as fast as a pigeon. And then you've got a dragon coming back in the opposite direction. I'm pretty sure they can fly faster than 60 miles an hour. So anyway, that's just.
I would prefer to give you that, except that I know the writers have admitted that they cheated that. I've seen them in an interview admit that they cheated it, and they knew that it didn't entirely work, but they did it for plot.
I've spent hours like working this out.
Oh, brilliant!
I mean, it worked nicely for plot, but it did have everybody go, "Wait, what? How did that just happen overnight? Surely that's too far."
Yeah, I know. But yeah, just to echo what you have both said, it is absolutely, I mean, the reason that I write fantasy is absolutely because of having the freedom, but also, it sounds quite counterintuitive, it's also having complete and utter control. So while you've got the freedom to do anything, you've also got complete control over those things that you do. If you set anything in the modern world, you don't have control over so many things. I mean, we're not talking like, societal conventions or anything, but, actual laws and actual physics and things like that. So when you've got the freedom to write anything, but you've also got the control to make any of that work, those two things, they just go together so nicely that you literally, I mean, it is sitting down in front of your computer and playing God, and that's quite addictive, it turns out.
It is. You're not wrong. I remember reading a thing. You've probably seen it. It was on social media somewhere, and it said somebody had put this post up saying, "I want to run my own D&D campaign. I want to GM it and play all of the characters, and just do it for myself." And then the next post said, "I have been informed this is called writing a novel."
Writing a book.
Oh, very good.
Yeah, but it's so true. And it's also, as someone who is currently DMing a campaign, you can't make them do what you want, your adventurers. They just make random decisions. And while my characters do that, I do at least have the luxury of killing my characters. Hi, adventurers, if any of you are planning on doing anything really weird on Friday night, just be aware, I'm not in the mood.
I will kill you.
I will kill you. So on that rather slightly frightening note, I think we're about done, unless anybody has any last comments on creating fantasy worlds or fantasy adventures. Any closing remarks?
I think so.
No, I think we've covered it very well. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to Cymera 2020 online. And thank you to whoever turns up to listen.